In Charleston, we convened a working session. We didn't do the informal session, just started with a working session. In my naivete, I thought that was going to be okay, and it was. I remember being very nervous about it. But it attracted Paula Brown Glick. Paula Brown had done work with the Chimbu in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Anton Plug, who's a Dutch anthropologist. James Boutillier, who was a historian, but at that time was very involved in Solomon Islands history. He lives in Victoria now. Marty Zelenitz, who was my office mate in graduate school, and went on to write science fiction and be a candidate for the NDP in Halifax area. Jeff White, who is a professor somewhere, and was a specialist in the study of religion and worked in Solomon Islands. Myself and Susie Flantz Cook and Ed Cook. And Ed had been involved in Melanesian anthropology from the very beginning of the Association of Social Anthropology in Oceania. And his wife Susie and he had done fieldwork in the highlands of New Guinea as well, in the Manga area. And then we brought in Klaus Friedrich Koch, who had written about conflict and warfare, to do the conclusions or the epilogue for the book. And Sir Raymond Firth did a prologue for us, I believe. No, maybe not. Yes, he did, a comment for us on pacification. And the book, this is the reissue of it. It was originally published in 1983. Yeah, no, but it was republished in 83. I think it was 79. Yeah, it was originally published in 79. And I remember why, because I was in the field when the book arrived, and it actually looked sort of more like this, it was like a really boring book. And it arrived, and I was thrilled. And Chief Matthias Teriundu, of whom I will give you a wonderful picture, who was our patron, and with whom we lived in the field in 1978 and 79, was there when we brought the mail home. And he liked to sit under the Namambwe tree out front and have a chat and look at what magazines we'd gotten and stuff like that. And he was proud of the fact that he was literate. And in his generation, there were very few who were literate. So I say, Matthias, look what arrived. It's like, I'm really pleased. And I hold it up to him. And he goes, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he looks through, he kind of flips through and goes, mm-hmm. And then he looks over and he sees a copy of National Geographic, and it's all bright and colorful. And he says, oh, you got that today too? Can I have a look? And he was lost in the National Geographic after that. So it took me down a peg. It was a good exercise in humility. The book itself, The Pacification of Melanesia, in its republished form, looked at what the function of warfare had been in indigenous societies in Melanesia, and why it was that pacification happened when it did in those societies. And in Papua New Guinea, the length of time between the arrival of outside contact, because as we know, the highlands were very cut off from Westerners, until the Leahy expeditions. So the amount of time between first contact, especially for the inland people, and pacification was very short. Whereas in coastal Melanesia and in the islands, like particularly in Vanuatu, it was a long time, like from the mid-1800s until about the 1930s, when pacification was complete. Well, it wasn't even then, but was more or less general. That is, that people no longer picked up arms to raid and to attack each other in groups under the directions of a leader. So the time in Vanuatu was long. It was almost 100 years, say. And why did it happen voluntarily in Vanuatu? Which it did. What happened was this. And we know this from a journal kept by a missionary named Bice, Reverend Bice. And he was an Anglican missionary stationed at Lullaby Bay, which was where we had stayed in 1969. It's where the Anglicans had created an outpost and created 2 schools, Torgil for girls and Vurius for boys, 2 boarding schools. They wanted to secure that area for the Anglicans. There was a lot of competition amongst the different religions, not just between the Protestants and the Catholics. The Catholic Marist brothers had staked out Lolapwepwe, which was about maybe 5 miles down the north side of the island. The island runs east to west. And we were on the southeast part, and the northeast was Catholic, Francophone and Catholic. And the Anglicans also competed with the Presbyterians, who had probably the most influence and most political influence in Anglophone Vanuatu. They really lobbied the English hard to come in and exercise control because there was concern the French would take over, and the Catholics. So the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, and the Catholics were the main players in the early colonization of the islands. Government had very little control, and they really only came in when the missionaries were being killed or complaining. So the missionary who kept a journal in the 1930s recorded how the last big pig chief, leader, high-rank rated society, and a man who had many, they called them malangelo, they were young men, living in his men's house. That man voluntarily gave up his right to make war. So the tradition was that women had their own houses made of bamboo and sago palm thatch. They raised the children in those houses. The men visited there. Lots of more intimate family relations took place in gardens, which were very private. And then when the boys were of a certain age, whether they decided they wanted to start sleeping in the men's house because they were tired of being with the women and children, or they reached puberty and they were told to go sleep in the men's house, they would sleep in the men's house or nakamal belonging to the big man of the village, because it took a big man to organize the building of one of those. In the south of Vanuatu, nakamal are open spaces where people gather, but in the north they are long structures, and quite an accomplishment to build one. So the men in this Chief Tamaringi's nakamal had launched a raid, and several people were killed. And it was after that raid that they decided to lay down their arms. And so why did they do that? Because they were beginning to see the benefits of 2 schools at the Anglican mission, of education. They were beginning to see the benefits of a road that had just been created by one of the white planters around that part of the island, so that they could bring their coconuts to market. And they could get stuff brought in. Well, trucks would not travel that road if they were going to get killed. And they couldn't really have graded society ceremonies if there was raiding. It wasn't safe. It was something you did. It was a sign that there was peace. That was a sign of tamwata, or peace, that you could have a graded society. Strangers could show up. They could sit there all day, dance all night, and not get killed, not get poisoned by your food. And there were little rituals where the man who made the kava would stick a little straw of palm straw into it and then touch it to his mouth for each of the shells as before the men drank, to show that it wasn't poison, because kava would have been easy to poison. It's very strong tasting, not very good. You could conceal all sorts of things in that. So peace was a prerequisite for graded society activity, schooling, and commerce. And by the 1930s, that was a deal worth making. And to voluntarily give up warfare was a bargain not between equals, clearly, but between people who were in a relationship. And my sense from what was written about Papua New Guinea at that time, and certainly since, is that it was never that kind of a relationship in the highlands. And so this book explores those kinds of concerns. And then it's certainly not the end of conflict. It's just there emerged other ways to resolve disputes. And I believe, and although I have no evidence for this, that the role of big men as negotiators and peacemakers increased once they could no longer settle things by raiding. And they were pretty vicious. I mean, many of the villages were palisaded in the 30s because the technique was to sneak up at night when everybody's, before dawn, when everybody's peacefully sleeping, and break in and kill people in their beds. So when that was no longer happening, everything else could flourish, and the skills as peacemakers also had an opportunity and an obligation, in fact, to increase. Courts came in. The district agents began to show up. Either the French district agent or the British district agent would show up and hold court, village, local court. And that's something that my husband, Bill Rodman, studied and has written about extensively, the legal and political imposition of order. The state never really controlled Vanuatu. It was always a voluntary thing to report crimes, right? If you didn't report them, and if the missionary or the government didn't hear about it, you just dealt with it yourself. And often that was the preference. So the missions played a huge role, planters played a role, chiefs played a role in ensuring peace in the society. We were in Vanuatu at the time when that book arrived, The Pacification of Melanesia, and the latest issue of National Geographic. And I was doing my doctoral research at that time. So I'll talk a bit about that. Again, it was under Matt Cooper's supervision, but also very much influenced by someone who was teaching at McMaster at that time named Woody Denham, who had studied the methods used to observe chimpanzees and other primates, and had done a study of, I'm trying not to smile because it was very useful to me, of Australian Aborigines in the wild, and he'd made his observations from the top of his Land Rover. He didn't want to contaminate the study by talking to people. Well, I'd never met an anthropologist like that, and I imagine the Australian Aborigines never had either. And he had some very useful advice about computerizing analysis. And Matt Cooper was also into, now I can't remember the system that we used, to do some more quantitative analysis of what we saw. And the way I translated the observation from the top of the Land Rover was into looking at maps and getting people to show me the land. So it took me back to times when I was a little girl walking the land with my father. And I dedicated the book to my parents, who first taught me to love the land, right? It was a way to get something that was more satisfying to me than just people's stories about land, and yet the stories were integral to it, because the way a person acquires land in Vanuatu is through their ability to tell a story. So if they can tell a story that is persuasive, that you and I believe it's true, yeah, I think it must be true. It sure sounds like it's true. I wasn't alive to remember that great-grandfather so-and-so gave this land to that great-grandfather so-and-so. But if you have the power of speech, which is also a gift when you're taking rank in the graded society, the power of speechifying, and you know your genealogy, and you use your land so you know where it stops and where it starts, then you can persuade other people that you're right. And it's at funerals that happens. So you make a case, and the kin are assembled. And if you're successful, then the spirit of the dead person is talked down from the tops of the trees and goes to the end of the island and goes up into the lake at the center. Or jumps off. I was never really sure which. There are two possibilities. So my doctoral fieldwork in 1978 and 79, which was a year, just a little over a year, focused on the land, and I had maps that I created a big wall map. I got aerial photographs from the British Air Force, these 3D ones, stereoscopic photographs, and used what I'd learned about statistical analysis and observation to create the land holding for hundreds of plots in this little 8 mile by about 2 mile area. I had the services of a surveyor from the condominium government as well. And he and his team came over and pulled string, as we put it, pulling a rope all around the district. And it was controversial. People wanted to know why. Surveyors were already something that people were wary of because land claims had preceded me, for sure, and not so much indigenous land claims against each other, but claims of expatriates to large amounts of land. It's said that the more of the New Hebrides was claimed by the French and the English and Australians than there was land by about the 60s. Most of it was never used, and so the effect of the claims were sometimes minimal, sometimes profound. So land was a controversial topic to be approaching, and people were really generally very kind. I changed all the names, I used numbers, and I've never released the exact names back to the people, just the numbered maps, because the land is now really controversial, as we'll see later on. So my dissertation focused on, it was called Customary Illusions, and it focused on how it was that these masters of tradition were able to manipulate the knowledge that they had for their own good and sometimes for what they saw as the good of the larger group of people. It was an illusion that they were people like everybody else because they really were much more able to control what was going on in the society than anybody else. But they operated within a framework of consensus, and so they had to listen to opposition and find ways to make what they were doing at least acceptable to everybody, like good enough. So the dissertation explores that, and how the masters of tradition use these, what I called customary illusions, to secure land, more land than other people for themselves, because if they had more land, they could have more coconuts, because the coast was filled in with coconuts by this time. If they had more coconuts, they could sell them. And I looked at the chain of copra, what happened when you sold a coconut in Longana and Bai, and where it went from there, and how it ended up in Marseille, and then often in Rotterdam. And what they were price takers, not price setters, and all of that, how the market impacted them, and whether they stopped making copra when the price was low. The answer was no, because they needed some money. They didn't need very much. They needed school fees and kerosene and matches and calico. And they were able to hold extensive conversations about this philosophy of working for money. And why would one actually want to do that? But then there was already Master Joe, who loved to work for money, but most people didn't. So that was an interesting part of the dissertation. And the other part that has held up and has been used by others, most recently a dissertation in 2016 that I just was an external examiner for at the ANU, is this notion of the masters of tradition and the ability to manipulate custom for their own ends and to make it appear as if they're following it to the letter of the law. So, I came home from Vanuatu in 1979, began to work on the data analysis, and was pregnant with my daughter, our second child, that summer, and she was born in April of 1980. And that first year, while I was pregnant with her, and then in the few months after she was born, with great support from my husband, who began cooking all the meals, I wrote my dissertation. She was one of those babies that was she slept when she was supposed to sleep, which I'm still grateful to her for that. And so I finished my dissertation on customary illusions in 1980, in the November of 81. It was, it takes months between when you think you're done. It's one of those things about a career in academia. I never know when a project is finished. That book was done, and then it was published, and that was done, and the dissertation was done, but then I didn't have my degree yet, and then I got that, and then so, but it was, the degree was conferred in the fall of 1981. And meanwhile, I had applied for, with Dorothy Count's encouragement, a postdoctoral fellowship to be, I'd applied to Sooke, but also the University of Waterloo had invited me to hold it there, and they offered us another year of fellowship and the opportunity to teach part-time there during what became, I guess it was the 3-year fellowship. It was 2 years from Sooke. So I started teaching there. It wasn't my first teaching experience because I'd been able to be a teaching assistant at McMaster, and I had taught a summer course while I was a McMaster student, which was to a bunch of women who were taking high school teachers, women high school teachers who were taking a course in the summer to improve their credentials, which gives them higher pay and is, professional improvement, professional development. So what a soft way to start teaching. I taught over in Stony Creek, Ontario. It was a night course. I would show up. I remember that they had a lectern, and it was just a lectern. You could see that my knees were shaking because I was so nervous. I could put my paper on the lectern, but my knees were just, and they took pity on me, and they were so supportive, and they gave me feedback, and I got better, and they seemed to enjoy the course, and I developed a very experiential way of teaching that focused on the student's learning experience. And I developed that more at the University of Waterloo, and then in all of my teaching. I've done big lecture classes. I came to enjoy that, but I don't get the joy out of it that I get out of the interactive format. And now I'm able to do an interactive format with 40 people. That's been a long time coming, and it's taken going outside of anthropology to learn that. So I now facilitate workshops in communication and aging well in community and things like that. So I learned to teach there was no teacher training practicum, as we then had at York later on, which I always recommended my students do. It was just learning by doing, and those poor women, the high school teachers. My approach to teaching is to create a problem, like a kinship problem, and have the students work together or alone. Some classes hate group work and some love it. And to come up with the solutions on their own and then test them out against each other.